Hey everybody, Nate Ferguson here from Escarpment Laboratories, and today we are talking about the fundamental principles for making great lagers. So, little intro. My name is Nate Ferguson. I'm one of the co-founders here at Escarpment Laboratories. I've been working in the beer industry for over 10 years, and outside of Escarpment, I'm also one of the professors at Niagara College for the Brewmaster and Brewery Operations programs, where I predominantly teach most of the brewing science courses. Now, the content we're talking about today is independent from my teaching role at Niagara College. However, it does reflect mine and Escarpment Labs' passion for sharing brewing knowledge to the wider community. My goal here, and Escarpment's goal here, is to provide free, accessible insights in brewing science techniques and methods and tools, helping both professional brewers and home brewers elevate the quality of their beer. Now, additional to all of this, Escarpment Labs is turning 10 years old. We've been doing this for 10 years. It's amazing. Keep your eyes peeled for some new posts or coming out regarding our 10th anniversary.
Now, I do want to make a point here and say that we are constantly learning, whether it be from literature, experiments, or better yet, our clients. This presentation we're going through is being recorded on April 25th, 2025, and all information we have here is based on that. There may be things we talk about today that in the future we know are an error, or might have an issue, might need needed detail. We'll add those things at those time, so when they can become available later on in the description. So if you just wanted the TLDR, you didn't want to go much further into this, here are the basics. Boil the beer hard for 90 minutes, knock the pH down a little bit to ensure the beer is dry, pitch lots of yeast, 1.5x to 2.25x the yeast, ferment the thing cold. We want this thing to be cold. I would start around 10 to 12 C. Cold condition the beer for a while, for a decent duration, and then filter. Now, the issue with lager brewing is that this has a lot of ambiguity. The reasons behind all these different things. You don't know whether or not you should or should not do any of these. So, if this is the first time you ever made a lager, here's what I'm going to suggest you do. Now, I'm going to keep in mind the goal for making lagers, in my opinion, the target is a Pilsner, but you don't start there. The first thing you should try to start off is making a boring, clean lager. So start with 2-row. Make something clean. Use a clean American ale yeast, something like ISAR or something like that. Once you've done that and you're happy with it, then bring on Pilsner malt. Start doing step infusion. Start doing, Pilsner malt at 52, then 66 to 76 degrees Celsius. Start getting some more control over the mash profile with Pilsner malt, keeping a clean ale yeast. Then adjust the mash as you see fit. If you want, add a more expressive lager yeast to the whole thing to try and dial in some sulfur, maybe an ester profile, and then continue to fine tune. I would suggest you start simple and work your way up. Start with something very clean, like light lager-like, and then work your way up to something more complex. You'll thank me for it. So, with all of this being said, I think the most important thing for us to start off with when it comes to lagers is talk about where they came from. So the term lager stems from the German word lagern, which directly translates to store or to keep. Now, this process of lagering became very common, or cold storing in caves became very common in Bavaria in around the 1400s. This was done to help prevent beer spoilage. When you ferment these beers in the warm summer months, the chance of contamination is going to be higher. So this became so popular that in 1533 Bavaria passed the second brewing regulation. Now, the first was Reinheitsgebot. Everyone always thinks that this was what restricted brewing. It wasn't. It was the second one. That restricted brewing to the end of September to the end of April, ensuring that all fermentations were cold, and therefore contamination rate was much lower. Now, beer was brewed cold, open fermented, and then stored under pressure, a little bit of pressure, mainly wooden vats. They didn't have access to caustic, they didn't have access to modern cleaning, they didn't have access to stainless because that wasn't a thing. So, and the main goal of this lager brewing, these methods, was to knock down contamination risk. Now, we have better ways to do that now. We have stainless, we have caustic, we have better ways to clean and CIP and sanitize everything. So with that in mind, why do we make lagers now? Well, simply put, there are certain flavor and physical changes that occur in the lagering process, not just the reduction in contamination, that we really enjoy to drink. So let's talk about them. So in general, there are two main different types of reactions we are trying to have occur during the lagering process. Now, the first is the removal of these protein polyphenol complexes, things that give the beer haze and sometimes some unnecessary bitterness. We want those to fall out of suspension. And the second one are sulfur compounds, mainly H2S. We typically want to flash off. We're going to talk about those protein polyphenol complexes first. So chill haze is a phenomenon where we have the proteins and polyphenols inside of beer at warm temperatures go inside a solution. They stay in solution. However, when we cool that beer down, the beer's ability to maintain these molecules in solution decreases, and we develop a haze, like you see here on the right-hand side. So when the beer is warm, beer is clear. When the beer is cold, beer is hazy. If we keep this beer cold and those haze particles that are present stay as a haze, they will eventually settle to the bottom of the vessel. In this case, if we let this beer in the glass for a long period of time, they eventually settle, take forever, don't do it in a glass. But in a fermenter, they will eventually settle. It just takes time. This is one of the main things we are trying to do with the lagering process. We want these protein polyphenol complexes to become a haze and then settle out to the bottom of the tank, making the beer taste slightly less bitter and smoother. Now, for those who make NEPAs, this is the same chemistry that occurs in a NEPA, except you want the haze to stay stable. Kind of neat. Now, the more of either proteins from the malt or polyphenols from the hops we have, the more likely we are to make haze, to have a hazy beer. The more haze we have in the beer, the longer the lagering process will take for that beer to go clear. Now, we can make the beer clearer by other methods. We can use things like Irish moss, also known as Wort, to help remove proteins that were from the malt. We can use things like higher alpha hops that just have less polyphenols. There are a bunch of different things we can go through in order to get this beer clear. What I do want to mention is this, though, is that if the haze falls out, there may be more molecules of haze behind it. You know, when we see a beer become hazy, one of the things that gives NEPAs a consistent haze is that it's not that the haze doesn't go away, it's that when the haze falls, there's new haze molecules that are there behind it. The more of these molecules we have inside of our beer, the longer it's going to take for lagers for it to become finished. Sulfur is a natural part of fermentation. Ales have sulfur. Ales produce tons of sulfur during fermentation because both lager and ale yeast have to go through certain amino acid syntheses for when they grow that produces these sulfur compounds. The difference is that at the warm temperatures we ferment ales at, that sulfur flashes off. At the colder, less aggressive fermentations we see with lagers, that sulfur is more likely to be retained. Now, if we lager these beers under a little bit of pressure, not much, or even vent it off every now and then, that sulfur will vent off in the headspace and we'll see more of that sulfur flash off. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. Some people want that sulfur in the beer. A beer like Heineken has a positive sulfur compound. If we want a beer that has very little sulfur to it, we want to have more open headspace and flash more of the sulfur off. Now, if we lager these beers under pressure, we will retain more of that sulfur because there's nowhere for the sulfur to go. It can't flash or vent off. So those are the two main steps. Now, that's a brief overview. We're now going to dive a lot further into each one of these different tones, mainly through how different processes change the composition of the proteins, the polyphenols, the sulfur compounds, all that stuff. So the most impactful things we can do when it comes to monitoring these things is our lagering temperature, or how we lager. Now, if you go online and you start looking around how many different ways there are to lager, you're going to find a bunch. So I'm going to try and break this down into a few different classes. So if we look at the traditional way, traditional lagering occur between 0 and 2 degrees Celsius for between 4 and 12 weeks, depending largely on the style and strength of the beer. A beer like a Helles, that's all malt but has less protein content to it, will lager for about 4 weeks to get clear. Or something that is a higher ABV, so meaning like a Doppelbock, might take 12 weeks in order for these flavor compounds and haze issues to settle out. It's a balancing act. Now, one thing you'll see some people do, especially some modern light lager brewers, is they will lager or store the beer at a higher temperature, much higher than the 0 to 2 degrees C. You'll see some people go between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. This is much higher. So let's explain why. So as we're all probably aware of this, when we have a colder environment, a colder liquid, everything is going to go slower. So when we're lagering between 0 and 2 degrees Celsius, we are going to see the rate of these reactions between proteins and polyphenols slow down. It's going to be reduced. This is because everything is reduced. Everything is slower because it's cold. The clumping or the flocculation rate will be decreased. The solubility of those flocks will be decreased too, which is nice. But the nice part is that our chance of having off flavors is reduced. If we increase the temperature to say 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, we're going to see everything move faster. Reactions occur faster, which means that the rate of those proteins and polyphenols reacting to each other will also increase, which means that the rate of flocculation or clumping will increase. That's great. It comes at a risk, though. It comes at a trade-off. It means that as this liquid is warmer, we're going to have an increased chance of having off flavors. This is why it's a balancing act. Typically, we require about 4 degrees Celsius or colder in order for flavor stability to be achieved or flavor improvements to be achieved. We're going to talk more about this in a separate video on step crashing, but there are some benefits to doing a mixture of the two or to prioritize one over the other. Now, some people, you got to go fast. Some people need to have lager done quickly. So if this is the case for you, here's what you can do. As I said before, you just want to have less protein and less polyphenols. So how can we do it? For protein, we can use things like Irish moss or Wort to knock these things out. We can also use ingredients instead of Pilsner malt, like 2-row barley, which has a lower protein content, or we can use even better yet, things like rice or corn. Rice and corn have functionally 0 protein to them. So if we use those, like we would in North American style lager, the chance of us getting a haze to begin with is a lot less. Well, we can also do things like a protein rest that will help break down some of the proteins associated with hazing. For the polyphenols, we can use products that are low in polyphenols. The polyphenols are present in the green material of the hop, not the alpha acids, just the green material. So if we use high alpha acid hops, where we have to use less physical hop material to get the bitterness, we will add less polyphenols. We can also use even better yet things like hop extracts. Hop extracts will have functionally very, very low or no polyphenol content to them, depending on which one you're working with. These are ways for us to add even less polyphenols. Now, finally, if your pH is out of whack, you can start stripping polyphenols from your malt. Make sure your pH is in check in order for you not to do that. And then the last part for this section is, how do you know when it's done? You'll see some people say you need a lager for at least 2 weeks, some people 6 weeks, some people 8 weeks, some 12. How do you know when your lager's done? Well, ultimately, it's up to you. There is no time that you have to lager for. You're not going to have the lager police come to your door and say, you can't call this a lager. It hasn't been lagered for 8 weeks or anything like that. When you think lagering is done, is when it's done. So with that, here are some tips. All those particles you've allowed to settle out of the beer during lagering, make sure they don't kick back up. Make sure you don't accidentally resuspend those particles. They can be very difficult or nearly impossible to actually refilter out of the beer. To facilitate this, go slow. Remove the beer from the racking arm or standpipe very gently, making sure everything that has fallen out of suspension stays there behind. Now finally, and this is a bit of an edge case, but I've seen enough people do it that I wanted to mention it, do not freeze the beer. When you freeze the beer, any sort of particles that have come out of suspension, that have settled out, can be broken apart. They can be restructured and unfold slightly, exposing new places, making them redissolve back inside of suspension. They can rebind to other molecules around them, giving you either a more difficult to remove haze or even in some cases a permanent haze. Don't freeze the beer. There's an asterisk beside that, it should be, because there is a thing called ice beer that we'll talk about in a separate video. So when you start looking at recipes for light lagers or just lagers in general, one of the first ingredients you're going to start seeing is Pilsner malt. There's a bunch of different suppliers for it. We got to talk about what it is because it is different than the normal barley you're probably used to. So Pilsner malt is different from most other malts in mainly 2 ways. First, it is not germinated or modified or malted for nearly as long as your standard 2-row barley. This means it's going to have less soluble nutrients for the yeast. The FAN content or the free amino nitrogen content will be lower. Additionally, it will not produce as much foam on its own. It has to be coaxed out. It's also going to have more beta-glucan concentration, which means it's going to be harder to work with, and if you have tall grain beds, might lead you to have stuck sparges. Additionally, it is kilned for a much lower temperature. It is kilned lower to make the beer lighter and brighter, which is what we want. But the trade-off there is it's going to have a higher concentration of what we call DMS, or dimethyl sulfide. DMS normally flashes off during the kilning process in the malt house. Because the temperature is so low, that doesn't happen with Pilsner malt, which means that we have to boil the beer for longer periods of time to make sure it flashes off. Now, if you're used to using, say, in North American style 2-row barley, or even better yet, English malts, these are both grains that have been highly germinated and killed at higher temperatures, that these two are not a problem. For Pilsner malt, they are. You have to treat Pilsner malt slightly differently. Now, the main way we treat it differently is typically with mash rests. Now, side note, mash rests are historically done with decoction brewing. We are separating those 2 different topics out. We are not talking about decoction, just mash rests. Now, these mash rests take more time, but they are very important when working with these grains. They allow you greater control, and if you don't do them, you run the risk of having some serious problems with your light beers. If you're using 2-row barley, these rests are functionally pointless. And actually, you might make a poor quality beer if you start doing mash rests with 2-row barley. 2-row barley, these steps have already been done in the malt house. Because for Pilsner malt, these steps have not been done in the malt house. They have to be done in the brew house. So there are a handful of different mash rests that occur. You don't have to do all of them, but we're going to just briefly talk through all of them so you understand what they each do. The acid rest or phytase rest occurs at between 35 and 40 C, and this lowers the pH of the mash. So if you're working somewhere that has very hard water and you don't have access to things like acid malt or lactic acid or phosphoric acid to do pH corrections, you need to use this mash, the acid rest or phytase rest. Now, if you have very tall mash beds, or you're having issues with lautering, too much time is being spent lautering your beer, getting the sugars off the grains, you probably benefit from doing a beta-glucanase rest between 40 and 45 C. This will help improve lauterability. If you're having issues with haze or foam issues inside of the beer, you probably want to do a peptidase rest between 45 and 50 C. This will get rid of a lot of the hazing issues, break down some of those big proteins into smaller proteins, and give you more foam on the beer. Now, if you're having issues with fermentation, there isn't enough nutrients available for your yeast, you probably want to do a protease rest between 50 and 55. This will also help get rid of haze and give you a little bit more foam, but mainly it helps give you the yeast cells more food. We then have our standard amylase rests. We have beta amylase at 62 to 64 and alpha amylase at 66 to 70. Now, normally with 2-row barley, we're just going to do a single infusion mash at, say, 66 degrees Celsius, 152 degrees Fahrenheit, and that'll be it. Hold it for 60 minutes and call it done. With a lot of the Pilsner malts, typically you'll separate the two out. You want to do a 63 degrees Celsius rest or so to help get fermentability, help really dry the beer out. And if you want more body for the beer, you can do an alpha amylase rest near 70, and this will help give you more dextrins, help giving the beer a bit more body and mouthfeel. When I think about using Pilsner malt versus 2-row barley, I kind of think of the difference between cooking from scratch or being a chef and making instant noodles or ramen. Pilsner malt, it's like you're buying raw vegetables and raw ingredients. You have to cut everything yourself, which also means you have far more control. You have far more control over the final product. For instant ramen or noodles, you add hot water and it's done, which is kind of like 2-row barley. You add hot water to 2-row barley and it's going to convert. It is very easy to work with, which, by the way, is the reason why we love it. It's the reason why 2-row barley is what it is. It is excellent because it's very easy to work with, just like how ramen is delicious and easy to make. For 2-row barley, you're going to spend less time in the mash tun, you're going to have less foam, and you're going to have less control. For Pilsner malt, you have more control, but you're going to spend more time in the brew house. Now, a few questions for this. You're going to find some ingredients that might be modifications of Pilsner malt. Things like Bohemian Pilsner malt, Chateau Pilsner malt, floor malted Pilsner malt, all these different types of Pilsner malt. These, generally speaking, talk to your maltsters, they'll tell you more information, are malts that are even more lightly modified, even less germinated than, say, 2-row barley. If you're performing multi-step rests, multi-step infusions or decoctions, these malts give you even more control over the entire process. They let you fine-tune all your different mash rests in. Now, if you want to make a really high-quality lager and you're currently using 2-row barley, I would not start here. You should not assume that the beer is going to be radically different with these ingredients the first time you use them. Kind of think of like driving a new car. How you drive or how you mash is more important. Other questions. What happens if I do a single infusion mash, 66 degrees C, 152 Fahrenheit, with under-modified grains? Well, let's walk it through. Because the grains are under-modified, there's going to be less food available to the yeast cells, so our fan levels will be low. This will cause stressed, slower fermentations that are more prone to off-flavours and stalling. We're also going to have more haze-positive proteins. This is going to give us longer lauter times, probably give us longer times in the lagering vessel because those proteins, there's more of them. They got to come out of solution. It's also probably going to give us less stable haze. We haven't done the rest in order to get that foam positive molecules into the wort. So we're probably going to have less foam on this thing. Now, if you don't have a mash tun with steam jackets and you can't do multiple rests, that's okay. The first brew houses I worked on didn't have this. I would suggest sticking with 2-row barley, but trying to add things like carapils, carafoam, or other ingredients to try and replicate it. It's not perfect. It's not going to be exactly the same, but it will get you something similar. So that's the protein portion. Now let's talk about the DMS. So DMS stands for dimethyl sulfide, and it's an organic sulfur compound. To identify it, if you want an example for it, go to the store, buy a can of canned corn, and open it. You will smell DMS. Now, DMS is found in all sorts of different grains, all sorts of different food, but it starts off as a molecule called SMM, or S-methylmethionine, and it's found in everywhere. It's naturally occurring in all plant cell walls. Now, normally in the kilning process, this SMM with heat will be converted into DMS and then flash off. But with the Pilsner malt, because the Pilsner malt is very lightly kilned, much more of this compound remains to the point where we really have to deal with it. Now, generally, you'll see a lot of resources say you have to boil your beer until about 5% of the total volume has left. This allows for a lot of grassy and grainy toned sulfitic compounds to flash off with the beer. The issue with Pilsner malt is that this isn't enough. So we know that when we're boiling the liquid, we're only going to see a percent removal of DMS. So at 40 minutes, we're going to see about 50% or half removed. 60 minutes, about 64.7% removed. And 90 minutes, near 80% removed. So let's say for a 2-row barley, we start off with 100 units of DMS. 40 minutes later, we're only going to have half of that amount, 100 units to 50 units. For Pilsner malt, instead of starting with 100, we may start off with 300. So after 40 minutes, we're say at 50% removal, I'm now going to be at about 150 units of the stuff. That's going to be very perceptible, very easy to be observed inside the product. Even at 60 minutes, 64.7 removal, we're still going to have a lot more present because it's only a percent removal. This is why we typically boil all Pilsners or anything that uses Pilsner malt for about 90 minutes. So we flash off nearly 80% of all the DMS, typically bringing us below that threshold. Now, there are some edge cases, things like Doppelbocks, where we might be making an 8% beer that's 100% or like 90% Pilsner malt and the rest a darker malt. That is a beer that might need to be boiled for longer than 90 minutes. There are some German recipes that suggest 120 minutes or 2 hours of boiling for those darker beers. This is partially to help flash off the DMS. So a little summary on here. Assuming a rapid boil between 8 and 10% evaporation rate, 90 minutes typically for lagers is what I recommend. So if your boil is less intense, you might need to add more time. So let's break down the ingredients. If we're working with high 100% Pilsner malt, that's going to be a high SMM content. So our risk for having DMS is going to be high. You need to make sure that thing is boiled aggressively. If I'm working with 100% 2-row barley, I have a medium to medium-low concentration of SMM. Not a huge concentration of DMS to work with. 60-minute boil is probably going to be enough. Now, if we go to 90, it's probably going to be cleaner, lighter, more effervescent, smoother. So 90 won't hurt it, but 60 is probably enough. Now, if we look at beers that say have corn or rice, these are grains that have very low to no SMM and DMS content. In which case, these beers, 60-minute boils is more than enough. You're not going because the concentration, the initial starting concentration of DMS is so low, we don't really have much of a problem with DMS in these styles of beers, or in Wort's beers that use these ingredients. Now, if you're still having a problem with 90-minute boils, here's some things I recommend. First off, extend the boil. Your boil intensity might not be as consistent as you expected. Sometimes it moves around. You may have other pieces of equipment that use the steam. If that's the case, your boil might start off really intense, but then fade off as the duration goes. You may also need to look at your kettle venting. DMS will solidify on anything it comes in contact with. And sometimes, especially if the kettle stack is straight up, that DMS can accumulate inside the vent stack, and once it reaches a critical mass, fall back inside of the kettle, making the beer taste again like DMS. Now, if you want a way to help troubleshoot this or help identify if this is what you're dealing with, try boiling your beer with the brew house's manway door or lid open. If you make the beer and there's no DMS issues, you probably have a vent stack issue. And finally, ensure that your wort is rapidly cooled. This is not common because most breweries have appropriately sized chillers, but if your liquid's staying hot for more than an hour and a half for cool out, you might have a situation where DMS is being reabsorbed back into the liquid. Not common, but if you did the first two prior and you're still having problems, I'd look at that. Another really important topic that we think people don't give enough credit to is acid. I've made these beers. Have you ever tried or had a beer that kind of tastes flabby, dull, or boring? Of course you have. I have. I've made them. This is likely because the pH of the beer was too high. Higher pHs make the beer taste rounder, less crisp and clean, and generally kind of muted, especially for light lagers. Now, side note, dark lagers may actually benefit from this. Slightly higher pHs can help enhance malt flavors. But for light lagers, this can really detract from drinkability. So why is this? Lower pHs help keep the beer bright, light, and clean. Now for ale yeast, well, all yeast during fermentation, they will produce acid or acidify the beer as they ferment. Lager yeasts do this, but in general, not nearly as much as ales. You can see here on the right-hand side, most of the lager yeast produce very little acidity during ferment. This means that if we just used a lager yeast like this, the beer's final pH would be higher and taste kind of weird, kind of dull, maybe boring. An easy way to help account for this or balance it out is to add a bit more acid to the kettle or to the whirlpool or to the mash tun, wherever in the process you want to add it. We need to acidify the beer ourselves a little bit to enhance drinkability. Now, general ranges for things like light lagers between 5.2 and 5.4. For darker beers, again, we want a little bit higher, so 5.4 to 5.6, and it helps round the beer out and make it a bit easier. Different yeast strains will have very different final pHs. The Belgians produce lots of acid and acidify, make the beer light and crisp. Lagers typically not so much. Saisons, also lots of acid. So if you want your beer to taste lighter, crisper, easier drinking, you probably need to add a little bit of acid to the beer. All right, another really important part for lager yeast is how many yeast cells that we add. Now, normally you're going to see information say that we pitch 1.5 to 2.25x the amount of yeast cells for lager yeast relative to ale yeast. Now you hopefully, if you're anything like me, will be asking, but why? Well, there's 3 very good reasons as to why we do this, so let's go through them. The first is that it's a colder fermentation, which means a slower metabolism. Without a higher pitch rate, the fermentation would take forever. Because each cell is working slower, if we want the beer to finish within a reasonable amount of time, we need more cells working. So by having, say, 1.5 or 2.25, the X amount of cells, the beer is going to finish at a faster rate. Number 2, lager yeast have more DNA per cell. This means that each cell is going to be slower to grow and require more energy. The larger cells means that fermentation will occur slower with these cells. Again, having more cells here will make everything go faster. And the final one, and this one also occurs for ale yeast, is that overpitching, adding more cells, equals a cleaner beer. Higher pitch rates, especially while cold, are going to give us cleaner flavors without excessive fermentation times. It's excellent. For lager yeast, my personal approach is that when in doubt, pitch more. But what happens if you underpitch? I've been here, I've had the wort in the fermenter and not had enough lager yeast or not had enough the amount of lager yeast I wanted. Now, I would never recommend that you underpitch or intentionally stress your cells out regardless of strain. So let's go walk through what happens if you underpitch. Your fermentations will be slower. You have fewer cells that are all cold. You're going to see a noticeable increase in fermentation times. You're going to have more cell growth. One cell is going to have to consume more sugars than it normally would. The more a cell consumes, the more growth it's going to go through, and the more it grows, the more it's going to produce off-flavours and esters, positive and negative. So by adding less cells, we're going to have more cell growth, which means more fermentation flavors, positive and negative. And finally, we're going to actually see an increase in cell stress. Because each cell is going to be going through twice as much work, we're going to see each cell accumulate a bit more stress. Now, this is sometimes unavoidable. If you find yourself in a situation, in order to make the best out of a bad situation, add more nutrients, so yeast X or yeast lightning, and add more oxygen. That's more in another video. So as a summary, why you should pitch lots of yeast. More yeast equals less yeast growth, which equals clean and faster, healthier fermentations. It's excellent. Too little yeast equals too much yeast growth, more off flavors. Not something we want. Now you're going to see different breweries have different pitch rates. Some will be at the 1.5, some will be near 3 million cells per mil per degree Plato. It's a bit of a Goldilocks effect here. There's multiple variables at play. It's not just one. You got to find what's right for you. If this is the first lager you've ever made, I'd recommend you start around 1.5 to 2. That tends to be a good area to begin with. One of the most important questions we have to ask when we're talking about lagers is the first one. Why do we ferment these lagers cold? It's very simple. There's one answer. It's to make a cleaner beer. Colder fermentations suppress esters, fusels, and all other fermentation flavor profiles, positive and negative. Now, a lack of fermentation flavor from yeast cells allows the malt and the hops and other ingredients to shine through and really be bright and expressive, or just for the beer to have less flavors in general. This does also mean that any imperfections that were inside of your beer to begin with are going to be more visible. It's the hard part for making lagers. The main reason we ferment these beers cold is to have less flavor profile. Now, lager yeast have a few adaptations that allow them to ferment even colder than ale yeast, which is why we use them. So lager yeast have different membrane compositions. They have more unsaturated fatty acids and modified sterols, allowing them to be less rigid in cold environments. It's one of their main adaptations for it that allows them to stay cold. They also have isoforms, or just a modified version of all their enzymes that allows them to be cold tolerant. These are enzymes associated with glycolysis, fermentation, mainly being alcohol dehydrogenase. These are all enzymes associated with fermentation that the yeast cells, lager yeast, have these modified cold tolerant versions of. And finally, they also have a change in stress response. They have cryoprotectants such as glycerol and trehalose that normal ale yeast have, but they have in higher concentrations that allow them to stay more fluid and maintain the cold environment more easily. Lager yeasts do have biochemical changes and advantages to ale yeast. So, a few common questions we get for this. Why not ferment lager yeast at ale temperatures? Say you don't have the ability to ferment as cold or cast your wort as cold. Well, this can be done. This is actually one of the main things that makes steam beer, or the San Francisco beer made famous by Anchor Steam Ale, or Anchor Steam Beer, what it is. Now, in my experience, higher temperatures for lager yeast tend to not be a desirable effect. The Anchor Steam strain is separate, it's different, but generally in my experience, fermenting lagers at higher temperatures tends to produce more of an umami or sulfury tones in a very unpleasant way. I personally wouldn't recommend it. There are some edge cases, but I'd say that there's exactly that, edge cases. So why not ferment an ale yeast at lager temperatures? Why not, instead of using a new yeast strain for lagers, just take your ale and ferment it cold? Well, simply put, ale yeasts can't do it as well. Some things like Kolsch and alt strains, they can go quite cold, but they can't go nearly as cold as lager yeasts. Now, the reason for this is that ale yeast, those enzymes, when they get colder, they stop functioning nearly as well, to the point where if you get them so cold, they'll actually stop and no longer function. So many of these enzymes are associated with metabolism, so the way in which the yeast cell actually produces energy. So when they get so cold, the strain will stop fermenting. It will stop consuming things. Not because it doesn't want to, but because it physically cannot handle, the enzymes physically cannot work at those colder temperatures. So now that we've covered those things, let's talk about the next big hot topic, or cold topic in this case, when it comes to fermentation for lagers. And that is, what temperature do we even handle this at? Now, I am oversimplifying this, but I like to kind of think about lager fermentation as one of 4 different categories. Your traditional, your modern, your fast lager, and your classic. So another note for this is that as we're going to break down each one of these 4, but as we go through, I want to note that there are some exceptions. There are some always edge cases to each one of these things. I'm not paying attention to those. So if you know a certain yeast strain that can handle, make a certain flavor compound at one of these different temperatures, that's an exception. I'm not talking about that today. The traditional lager, or the classic, this is the way in which a lot of European or kind of continental style lagers are made. Typically, we're going to cast the beer out between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius, usually around 10, and we're going to achieve a very clean fermentation flavor profile over about a 2 or 3 week period. This is great. This is the classic way in which you see historically lagers being produced. Now, the downside is that it's slower. Now, because it's slower, if you want to make a lot of it, you require more tanks, which can be costly, which is why people use other methods. Now, a modern version of this, or modern macro beer fermentation, would be a slightly higher fermentation temperature, somewhere between 10 and 13 degrees Celsius. Sometimes this will go even a bit higher, up to like 15. Now, with this method, you're going to achieve a nice balance between flavor and speed. You're also going to get slightly more esters than a traditional temperature and flavors will not be as bright. Your malt won't be as shiny. Your hops won't pop nearly as much. But it can produce very high quality beers, especially when coupled with a few other methods. Now, some issues with this. Maybe not issues, but some things to note. You're going to get more esters. Now, some people like this. For a lot of the macro beers, they'll want a little bit of ester profile to help separate the beer up from the others. Now, the malt won't be as bright, but if we're already using 2-row or in corn and rice, that's a feature, not a flaw. That's a good thing. So this, when we're looking at North American style light lager, fermenting at these higher temperatures has a lot of positives. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you ferment a North American style light lager at a colder temperature. You'll probably get flavors you don't want. Then we have a fast lager. Now the goal for this lager is just to create beer. I can't stress enough. It's this typically functional alcohol. We're looking to ferment these beers in 5 to 10 days. And one of the ways we do it is we lager or ferment at 14 to 17 degrees Celsius. We go fast. We're going to get more esters and diacetyl, which will be a problem, but there are some things we can do to help balance those things off or flash them off. If you choose this, just be aware that you're not going to have, your malt's not going to shine, your hops aren't going to shine. It's going to taste more like just kind of commodity beer. But if that's what you want, this is the temperature range for you. And then last, we have the classic, the old school traditional version of this. And this is a long, slow fermentation between 5 to 7, maybe 8 degrees Celsius. You're going to have the finest expression of malt and hops. Your yeast flavor compounds are going to be minimal at best. Very, very low yeast expression. The flavors will be the most delicate. If you're looking for true expression of malt and hops, this is typically what you want to go with. But as we discussed so far, this is going to be slow. We are nearing the edge of the ability of the lager yeast cells able to ferment. If you go even colder than 5, lager yeasts, their enzymes are no longer, they're not that cryoprotectant. And these fermentations will take 30 plus days. They are slow, which brings up a question. Can we go too cold? Well, you kind of can. When we ferment around 5 degrees Celsius, we will produce beers that are incredibly clean. But especially the first batch, it's going to require a long time to begin. Over subsequent batches, these yeast cells we use at 5C can develop some adaptations. They can kind of further acclimate to the environment. But especially those first ones, those fermentations will take 30 plus days. It is a long, slow fermentation. But if those are the flavor profiles you want, you are rewarded for it. So with all this in mind, where should you start? How do I choose my own adventure on this? If this is the first lager you've ever made, I'm going to suggest you start at 12. Ferment it out and test it. See if you're happy with it. If you want the beer cleaner, lower the temperature. Or maybe add more yeast cells. If you want the beer faster, raise the temperature a bit. Or maybe add more yeast cells. Maybe add a bit more oxygen there if you want a bit more, if you want the beer faster too. As we increase the temperature, we'll get more fermentation flavor profile out of the beer. That's separate talk. So, some good practices when it comes to making all these lagers. It's always a good practice to cool your wort 1 to 2 degrees Celsius colder than what you want to ferment at. Now, the reason for this is twofold. One, yeasts don't like rapid cooling. When the yeast cells are near the glycol jackets, which they typically are at the beginning of fermentation, if they see that really cold glycol beside them, that can shock them, a cold shock, which then can hurt the membranes, causing them to be further slowed down or delayed. Now, yeast cells like gentle warming. A small increase in warming, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, that's very easy for them to do. But when the yeast cells are cold shocked or have to acclimate their membranes, this can cause further delays or further issues. And this temperature, the second reason, this 1 to 2 degrees Celsius colder allows the yeast cells to alter the membrane proteins and their membrane composition more smoothly. We're not asking them to quickly go into the area and then quickly adapt to further cold. We're asking them to adapt to cold and then slowly rise up. And that warming sensation, that warming of them is much easier for them to take care of. Now, side note, if you're going with the old school traditional classic 5 to 7 degrees Celsius fermentation, I wouldn't really recommend this. This can be too cold for the yeast cells and really stress them out. So I wouldn't really recommend them for that low temperature. Some do it. I wouldn't recommend it. Now, other few bits. Lager yeasts typically need more oxygen. The reason they need this has to do with their membranes. So lager yeast cells have a much higher concentration of unsaturated fatty acids in their membrane. This is one of the things that allows them to handle the very cold temperatures. In order to produce those unsaturated fatty acids, they need oxygen. That's why. If we don't provide them enough oxygen, the membranes become more rigid, making it more difficult for the cells to transport sugar across the membrane, causing a greater chance of halting fermentations. Not having enough oxygen can be one of the main causes, not only of stalled fermentation, but also off-flavors in lager fermentations. This then opens up a can of worms when it comes to oxygen. And then one of the main questions I've heard is, can we over-aerate? And the answer here is kinda. Assuming the cells are able to rapidly consume the oxygen, so if they haven't been stored for more than a week, if they have been stored for more than a week, sometimes you need to feed them a little bit, get them back into back respiring, back consuming and alive again before we add oxygen. Otherwise, the oxygen just oxidizes the cells and it damages them. If we add more oxygen, we're going to cause more cell growth, which will cause more esters. That can be a good or a bad thing, depends what you're shooting for. If we want a super clean lager, typically shoot between 10 ppms of oxygen. That will minimize cell growth, minimize ester production. If you're looking for that, that's what you want. Now, some breweries will use air for their oxygen. A lot of the macro breweries will use just compressed air for their oxygen. And this will typically get us, you can see on the right-hand side, about a total of about 8 ppm, which is not enough for the 10 ppms of oxygen we're shooting for. You'll see a handful of breweries that do this also add another pulse of air into the batch 6 to 12 hours later to help top it up. Bring it from, say, 6 or 8 ppms up to 10 to 12 ppms of oxygen for a beer like this. Now, if you are using pure O2 and you have around atmospheric pressures, you can get about 35 to 38 ppm, so a lot higher oxygen. If you have a lot of back pressure at, say, 2 atmospheres, you can get well over 45. I would not recommend you use pure oxygen if you have that much back pressure. You're more likely to cause some problems. So when it comes to choosing the right aeration rate, it depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on what your goal is. And it's multivariable systems here. So a clean, traditional kind of lager, we're talking, 8 to 10 degrees Celsius fermentation, I would shoot for 10 to 12 ppms with just O2. Or do the same thing with a modern twist and shoot for the same O2, but use compressed air and do a second pulse 6 to 12 hours later. If you need high cell growth, say you have this one batch that has a fresh pitch of yeast in, and you need to split that yeast off into 3 or 4 different tanks, I would over-aerate. Go to 15 to 20 ppms, probably with just O2. And if you want a traditional kind of elevated ester profile, something you'd see with a Bock or something like that, 10 to 15 ppms with air or O2 is a good idea. Now, there's other variables at play here, things like yeast nutrient availability, all sorts of different things, but this is just your starting point. Now, one of the ways we can help kind of modulate or control some of these flavors, whether it be ester profile or diacetyl or things like that, is with a common technique known as a free rise or a diacetyl rest. So the free rise is commonly done by near the end of fermentation, elevating the temperature of the beer. Sometimes as little as 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. Some places go more, especially for Belgians, but for lagers, 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. And this works in a few different ways. The free rise, it helps strip off a lot of sulfur compounds in the beer. That can be a good or a bad thing. So the elevation in temperature also helps the yeast cells reabsorb diacetyl. It also helps break down esters at a faster rate and flash them off. These are all, depending on what you're trying to go for, good or bad elements for the beer. If you're making a modern, kind of beer, you're making a North American style light lager or anything like that, this is phenomenal. We want less diacetyl, less esters, less sulfur. Sign me up. This is perfect. If we're making a classic style lager, we may want some of that sulfur. This may not be appropriate. If you don't want the sulfur, this might be what you want to do. If we're making an old school 5 to 7 degrees Celsius fermentation, I would not recommend this. You're going to lose a lot of the flavor profiles that you spent time and energy trying to develop in this beer. And the second most common off flavor we see, diacetyl being the first, that we see in lagers is acetaldehyde, or just aldehydes in general. Now, aldehyde issues typically stem from one of two places, either a lack of Wort aeration or a lack of zinc. Let's break them down. So a lack of Wort aeration results in fusel alcohols or aldehydes because the yeast cell has run out of energy. It no longer has the energy to reuptake the diacetyl, reuptake the acetaldehyde, and break down the fusels. It's very rare that we see one of these things without the other. So if we only have aldehydes, it probably isn't a lack of Wort aeration. But if you have fusels, diacetyl, and aldehydes, or any combination of the three, it might be a lack of Wort aeration. Now, if we just have aldehydes, your issue here is probably zinc. Zinc is used by the main enzyme that breaks down aldehydes into their alcohols, alcohol dehydrogenase. If we don't have enough zinc, we will just have aldehyde issues in the beer. That's it. One of the main things I've been saying here has been aldehydes, not just acetaldehyde. Many breweries will have aldehydes in their beer that are not acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is that classic kind of green apple flavor, where many other aldehydes will kind of be this like slight sharp, not quite bitter, not quite acidic sensation right on the back of the palate. If this is a taste you're getting, it might be other non-acetaldehyde aldehydes, in which case the solution is the same. Add a bit more zinc. If you add the zinc into the whirlpool, that zinc is more likely to fall out of suspension and precipitate out with the trub. Zinc is meant to be added on the cold side. Or you can add a high-quality yeast nutrient like Yeast Lightning that has bioavailable zinc in it. You don't have to worry. If you want more on this topic, we have a full blog post online that you can find more about it. So, when it comes to choosing a lager yeast, there's not as many options. Lager yeast, unlike ales, don't have, say, Belgian ale yeast and North American ale yeast and English ale yeast. There's only a few different lager yeast for you to choose from because the strain is newer and it hasn't been as selected for. So if this is your first time making a lager, here's what I'm going to suggest you do. I'm going to suggest you start with something clean like Mexican lager, American lager, Iceland lager, something that's not going to give you a lot of headache. Now, if we want a more expressive, either be esters or sulfur profile, maybe a delicate malt characteristic that's going to be emphasized, I'd suggest you go with something like Beer Garden, my personal favorite lager yeast, Premium Pils or Staffelberg. These are more expressive lager yeast. And then finally, if you want something completely different or something maybe specialized for a different application, you have things like Nova Lager. And my suggestion is always to start with something clean and then work your way up. Is the need to dump the yeast cells near either at FG or when the beer is approaching FG. So let's explain why. When yeast cells are finished fermenting, they will begin to release the following: fatty acids, which can taste rancid or soapy, especially when oxidized; amines that can taste meaty or umami-based, not what we want in light lagers; and sulfur compounds. This is different than the ones we see during fermentation. These are more rubber, onions, really not pleasant. This can be exacerbated when the culture is older or poor health, stored warm, or under pressure. By removing the yeast cells, we stop them from being able to secrete these things into the beer because they're no longer in the beer, improving the beer overall. This is a great idea to do simply for this part. But wait, there's more. The yeast cells from the beer will also prevent the beer's pH from increasing. So when the pH of the beer increases, it can often taste kind of flabby, dull, or kind of listless, lifeless. This, coupled with the fatty acid and amine secretion we just saw before, can seriously alter drinkability. By removing the yeast cells from the beer near the end of ferment, the yeast cells cannot produce these compounds that elevate the pH, causing the beer to taste or feel flabby. This is another reason we want to remove the yeast cells from the bottom of the tank. But there's more! Wait, there's more! Removing the yeast cells can also help enhance those protein polyphenol complexes to settle at the bottom of the tank. Yeast cells are negatively charged. Removing them helps reduce what we call the electrostatic repulsion inside the liquid, which prevents the proteins and polyphenols from binding to each other and then settling. By removing all these negative charges, we can enhance that settling process, making the lagering process either more efficient or take less time. This means that we'll have less yeast haze, which means we'll have more protein and polyphenol haze settling out of solution. It's excellent. This is a very good thing to do. But there's more. Less yeast also helps maintain the foam in the beer. By removing the yeast cells from the beer, the foam is maintained. When yeast cells are near the end of ferment or is being stored, they will secrete mannins and lipids that interfere with the foam production inside the beer. When stressed, yeast cells will also secrete proteases that break down the proteins associated with foam. By removing the yeast cells out of the tank, we in net enhance the foam of the beer by making sure that two different types of things don't occur. The mannins and lipids aren't secreted by the yeast cells, and the yeast cells don't try to consume the foam proteins for food. So that's it. Those are all the reasons why we want to remove the yeast cells ASAP at FG. We want to prevent the pH of the beer from rising, ensuring we have a clean and crisp flavor. We want to minimize the risk of having rancid, umami, or sulfitic tones due to yeast autolysis inside the beer. We want to ensure the foam is stable, so we want to minimize lipid content and not have the yeast cells secrete proteases, maximizing the foam proteins. And additionally, we want to help any of those kind of protein polyphenol complexes settle out to the bottom of the tank. This is excellent. This is exactly what we want to do. Now, In doing all of this, you hopefully will have collected a large amount of yeast cells from these tanks. As we're removing the yeast cells from the tank, we can harvest those yeast cells and then repitch them into the next batches. As long as the yeast cells smell good, look good, taste good, and ideally are cell counted, they can be reused. Now, if you want more information on yeast cell counting and repitching, keep your eyes peeled. We're about to release some content on how to manage yeast cells inside the brewery. Let's talk about the different types of lagers that we have out there. So not all lagers are made the same way, and I like to put most lagers into one of two categories. Now, this isn't a perfect categorization, but I think it works pretty well. In my mind, we have our North American lagers. These are Canadian, American, and Mexican lagers, things like Molson Canadian, Coors Light, and Corona. These are all light-bodied, very clean, easy drinking. We then have our Continental lagers. A little bit of a gross oversimplification. We could easily break this out even in like Bavaria to the rest of Germany. But in general, these are all malt-forward, sweeter, fuller-bodied lagers. So some examples. For North American, we have North American Light Lager, Premium Lager, Mexican Lager, Steam Beer, and kind of Italian Pilsner. It's a weird one. I almost didn't include it. We then also have some beer styles that are not lagers, but are very similar, being cream ales and blonde ales. For the European or continental, we have things like the Munich Helles, Vienna Lager, Czech Lager, German Pils, Fest beers, Dunkels. And we also have some ale equivalents, being Kolsch's and alt beers, that are not lagers, but function like them. So in general, when we're looking for these beer styles, we can kind of make some distinctions. The North Americans typically want minimal to no ester profile, minimal to no sulfur characteristics, no off-flavors, with exception of discount beers, but that's why they're discount, a drier finish, higher carbonation, less foam, and overall the flavor knob is pretty low. Like the flavor intensity is only like a 3 or 4 out of 10. None of these beers go to 11. The continental versions typically will want low to moderate ester profile. A little bit of esters are okay. Low to moderate sulfur, again, it's a little bit's okay. No off flavors, more malt-driven tones, so a bit more of a biscuit kind of bready or just sweet characteristic. Medium to medium-high carbonation, sometimes a bit lower than the North American versions. Much more foam potential, and overall the flavors are a bit higher, 4 to 6. So how do we make North American style lager? Well, there's a few very common techniques for it. So the first is a free rise. Make sure near the end of fermentation, let the beer warm up 1 to 4 degrees Celsius higher to help help reabsorb diacetyl, flash off some sulfur, flash off some esters. This is a great idea. The strain selection for these beers becomes very important. We need typically strains that require less zinc, less fan, less things like that. If we have problems, like aldehyde issues, they still will need zinc. Not like they don't need it, they just need less. And we typically can reduce the wort aeration to a minimum. We don't want ester profile, which means less aeration typically. We also typically want to pitch more yeast on the higher end, close to 2.25, because we want to have even less cell growth to keep the flavors clean. Now that free rise that I was talking about beforehand becomes very important for this beer style, very common, because it's going to decrease those sulfur compounds. Any sulfur compounds that are produced through cell growth need to flash off. We're also going to reabsorb some of that acetaldehyde, hopefully, by making the yeast cells easier to do it. Same thing goes for diacetyl. That increase in temperature will make it easier for the yeast cell to reabsorb acetaldehyde and diacetyl to maintain flavor stability. It's also going to accelerate clarity. When we increase the temperature, we increase the rate of reaction between proteins and polyphenols, accelerating settling or haze formation and dropout. And we're going to diminish the malt and hop tones. Not always a good thing, but in this case, for North American style light lagers, generally a good thing. Now for continental style lagers, it's a bit different, and we're going to see a bit more variability on this. And there'll be a few things that we'll have to tie off into other videos. So in general, I would start these beers around 10 to 12 degrees Celsius. These are going to be a slower fermentation that will produce less off flavors, more esters depending on some other variables, and generally more of a sulfur compounds that we want inside these beers. Now, how these beers are handled will change radically based on what flavors we want out of the product. In this case, we're knocking out around 6, very cold, and letting free rise up to 9. This is going to be a slow and cold fermentation. And in this case, and we'll talk about it later, it was step crashing. We can see the wort get crashed several times. And what they're trying to do here is they're trying to maintain a stable drop in gravity. This ensures clean flavor profiles, minimal flavor compound production, but also a gradual steady decrease in gravity, which is the ideal here. Now, some other ones are going to be a bit different. This is a Czech style lager. It's pitched quite cold and allowed to ferment, allowed to free rise up. only about 65 degrees C or so, which is not warm. It's about 12 degrees Celsius. And then slowly ramp down 2 degrees Fahrenheit per day until we reach lager temperature. We will talk about step crashing and why we do this at a later point. So for both these beer styles, can we take shortcuts? On the road to success, there are no shortcuts. Kinda. So for North American style light lagers, yeah, we've already done a lot of things that make our lives easier. For haze stability, we've added things like Irish moss. We're using rice and corn in order to make sure there's less protein. We're using hop extracts or higher alpha hops in order so we get less haze to begin with. We're doing a lot of things that are going to make the product faster and cleaner, which is the ideal. If you want a continental style lager though, there aren't any real ways to make the thing faster. Now you can take shortcuts or modify things to go faster, but just be aware that you're doing so at the expense of something else. Now it's not wrong, it's not bad, it's not better or worse, it's just different. There are different things that you have to do in order to suit the beers you are trying to make with what you have available to you. So to emphasize this, I want to use this graph to represent it. So what we have here is the same wort that was fermented 2 different ways. On the bottom, it took about 16 days to ferment out. That is a North American style fermentation. Very fast, very efficient, very clean and neutral. On the top, we have a standard Czech style fermentation, which took nearly 60 days to complete, 15 days for the North American. This means that it takes 4 times the amount of time roughly for a Czech style beer or a old school 5 degrees Celsius knockout beer to complete than a North American style beer. This can be a serious limitation for many breweries. This is not possible for many breweries, which means that you have to choose the route that is best for you when it comes to lagering time, fermentation temperature, aeration rate, pitch rate. These are all things that are going to influence each other that you have to choose. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you learned something that can make your beer better. If you want to learn more, you can go to our knowledge base, you can go to our YouTube that has over 50 hours of content, and read our blogs that will all be there to help you improve the quality of your beer. Thanks for watching, everyone.